And I guess the other huge benefit is when you've been involved in one of these processes, you are what psychologists call primed, which is having thought about what might lead to these scenarios.
Mm,
You're much more likely to see them
okay.
if they become rising trends.
Every business could gain by looking through the eyes of an artist, says today's Ask an Expert. Hi, I'm Joshua Carlson, co-founder of Propelo Media, and today I sit down with Margaret Heffernan. She's an international speaker, she's a best-selling author, and she's an entrepreneur who you've probably already seen through a number of TED Talks. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of legitimacy and process. All this really means is if you can get more of your employees involved in the decision-making process, not only are you going to have better ideas, but you're going to have buy-in when some people don't necessarily agree on what idea was ultimately selected. Next, we're going to talk about scenario planning and experimentation. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that the status quo isn't always here to stay. And using experimentation and using scenario planning is a great way to come up with ideas that allow you to adapt quickly. And finally, we're going to talk about diversity and its importance in the workplace, not just from an HR standpoint because it looks good in PR, but because it's a great way for you to avoid tremendous landmines and for you to expose tremendous opportunity within the marketplace. If you like what Margaret had to say today, please hit the like button and subscribe. That way you're notified when we drop our next video. Now let's hear what Margaret has to say. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on our Ask an Expert series.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so first off, I have to ask, as the world changed dramatically several months ago, you found yourself moving into the home delivery business for the local farm stand. I'm curious if you're still delivering goods to your local community.
I am no longer delivering goods to my local community, but quite a number of my drivers are.
Okay,
Um, what happened is, I think lots of people did this. You're suddenly in a crisis. So my first thought was, how can I help?
sure.
And my neighbor has a farm and has a farm shop and was decrying the fact that he had no deliverers. So I said, well, I'll do deliveries for you. And lo and behold, I find myself running a team of 10 delivery people. When we came out of lockdown, I basically handed over the business
Okay,
to one of the drivers, just saying, if you need me, call me back. But I think, demand will decline as it has done, but it hasn't gone away.
sure.
So people are still delivering, but I have been released.
Okay. Well, as an entrepreneur, it was certainly an interesting one you found yourself in.
Well, it was also sort of funny because, as it was a classic entrepreneurial thing, right? You just
Yep,
spot a need and you just rush for it.
sure.
And I was glad I did it. And it's so funny because it's probably nearly 20 years since I've actually run a business. My
Okay.
last business was a tech company in Boston. And I suddenly had this moment of kind of self-doubt and thought, oh my God, do I still know how to manage people? And then I thought, actually, Margaret, just do what it says in all your books and you'll be okay. And that's what I did, and it was fine.
Okay, well, speaking of transition and change, I want to talk about something that you've talked about, which I feel is very topical right now, which is the importance of legitimacy in the process. And
Mm.
obviously, there's tremendous political implications right now, which I think that we could talk for hours and hours on. But I want to talk about this organizationally, and how I heard you explain it was just that we're going to make decisions, whether it's political, it's country, or it's organizationally, that not everybody is going to agree on. So it's very important that we have a process in place so that we can get buy-in. And I'd like you to expand upon that.
Yeah. This observation really grew out of my writing about the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, which was
Okay.
a big event
Yeah.
to look at amending the Irish Constitution. And the Citizens' Assembly was brought together to debate a number of issues to do with climate change and aging population, but it's probably most well known for debating amending the Constitution, which banned abortion in Ireland. And to cut a very long story short, essentially what happened is over a period of 16 months, citizens came together and debated what should happen. And they were given lots and lots of information from both from experts and from people talking about their lived experience in terms of facing this choice.
Okay.
And they were asked to come up with a recommendation to the Irish government. Every single presentation was made available to the public. Every single briefing document was made available to the public in English, in Irish, and in Braille,
Okay.
and in sign language. And the consequence was that, if you wanted to, you could really participate in this process.
Sure.
And the upshot of it was they recommended that there be a referendum, and they showed what their own outcome was, which
Okay.
was approximately 65 to 35 in favor of the amendment. Everybody thought, well, this will never happen in Ireland. But the referendum went forward, and the result was almost exactly what the Citizens' Assembly vote had been. What's most compelling, I think, about this exercise, because there's lots in it that's super interesting, is that what was so remarkable is that even the people who didn't agree with the outcome supported it, because they felt that the process by which it had been reached was legitimate. They had been allowed to participate if they wanted to. They understood where the whole process had come from. It had been run with maximum transparency. So they didn't feel people were stupid. They didn't feel people had been bullied or cajoled. They didn't feel that people had been lied to. They knew that everybody had the opportunity to consume absolutely reliable information, and on the basis of that to make their own decision. And I think whether you're talking about a country or whether you're talking about a company, I think there's a really profound lesson here, which is to the degree that people participate in decisions and are part of the process by which they're made, even when they don't like the outcome, they can live with it. And, it's interesting because, Thanksgiving's coming up. And one of the companies I've written about is a company which everybody in America will know, Ocean Spray, right?
Yes.
And Ocean Spray, which fewer people know, is a cooperative, which means that all the cranberry farmers who are part of Ocean Spray have a vote on big strategic decisions. And several years ago, Pepsi wanted to buy Ocean Spray, and they put on lots of, glamorous events to talk about how lovely life would be if they were part of the Texaco family. And I think they flew in Britney Spears to, do a gig, and all this sort of stuff. And, and in the end, there was a big discussion and vote. And the vote was something like 49.9% to 50.1% in favor of staying an independent cooperative.
Wow.
And what the CEO, Randy Papadella, said to me is, what was extraordinary and so impressive about the whole cooperative model is that the next day, everybody got behind the decision.
Right.
That's the thing. Everybody was involved. Everybody had all the information that they needed. And so even though they weren't necessarily happy with the outcome, they could support it because they felt it was fair and free.
It actually reminds me of a saying that was shared to me from a mentor, which said, I get paid first for my opinion, and I get paid first to buy in. So as long as there's this dialogue up front where there's an opportunity to converse, to debate, right, and to challenge ideas, then I can get behind it. I'm curious from your perspective, do you feel that this is something that leadership has pushed and people have followed? Or do you feel that this is something where, whether it's the farmers in Ocean Spray, they've kind of demanded this environment and leadership has followed that demand?
Well, I think in the case of the cooperative, that's specifically how it's structured. And it's one of the oldest co-ops in America, and there are many co-ops in America. So that was built that way in order that the farmers not lose their independence, but they gain access to greater, marketing and scientific expertise, which is provided, through the kind of the holding company. I think in companies, I think it's quite interesting. We know in companies that there are more insight and intelligence and creativity in the whole company, right, than in one or two, even super smart people. So a big job of leadership is how do you capture that? You can see, I used to work in the software world. You can see through hackathons, that people routinely can solve problems that they didn't make, because they're
Yeah.
bringing a different lens to it. You see
Right.
exactly the same thing with open innovation platforms. So I think, what I see is that lots and lots of companies have lots of creativity and lots of great thinking inside their organization. But the leadership challenge is, how do you get it out where you can see it and use it?
Right.
And that's both about convening the right people, in some cases, everybody, making sure that everybody has the same reliable information, and trusting people enough and trusting the process enough, not to guarantee that we'll do exactly what everybody wants, but to guarantee to listen and to take it seriously. And there are lots of examples I can cite that do this.
Hmm.
It's a lot of companies are moving towards what they call open strategy, where they will even bring not just the workforce, but business partners and suppliers and so on,
Yeah.
to say, okay, what should we be doing next? And the lesson is fundamentally the same, which is that when people are involved in a decision, they are more likely to support it. And furthermore, you don't have to sell a decision that people were part of making.
Right.
When I think of, the opposite process, which is, I don't know what to do, I'm going to call in some big expensive consulting firm. They're going to devise a big expensive transformation program.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go around to everybody telling them why they have to suck it up.
Yeah.
And we know that the vast majority of these programs don't work.
Right.
And one reason they don't work is because nobody has any investment in them. They don't know where they came from. They're not regarded as legitimate. They're often seen as a fad. They're often seen as code for cost cutting, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But they hit this rock solid kind of layer of cynicism and skepticism, which means that even if there are lots of good ideas in them, they're super hard to implement.
Right. Well, I'm curious from this standpoint of as far as engaging, and I love this concept of really crowdsourcing these ideas from not just internally, but with your partners and strategic vendors. I think that you can reveal so many more clever and creative solutions. But as an entrepreneur, I'm curious from your standpoint. I do feel like there is a yin and yang, a tug of war between having a process like that, which is very open, it's very transparent. Um, it's typically going to have a longer cycle because there's more moving parts, there's more information coming in. There's a change in the marketplace. We need to respond incredibly quickly to be able to capitalize on that. Where do you thread the needle or toe that line to keep a balance between both?
Well, first of all, I don't think it is necessarily really slow. I
Okay.
think your consultant-driven transformation program, is usually extremely slow.
Okay.
I'm very struck, in his book about Pixar. There's a great story told about when Pixar decided their movies were all getting too expensive, and they needed to cut the budgets. But I think they decided by 10%, because they were getting more expensive, because they were slower, and they were slower, and they were getting kind of more lugubrious because schedules and money tend to go together. And what they did is they shut the company for one day. They brought everybody together, having briefed them about what this was for. Collectively, the company came up with about 20%
Wow.
of production costs.
Sure.
And when all these new things were rolled out, everybody knew why and where they came from. So that was fast. That was
Yeah.
really
That's
fast.
incredibly
And I
fast.
would I would speak from my own experience of running a company that needed to be repositioned really quickly. And I grabbed a whole bunch of people from the company, and we went away and kind of worked it through over a couple of days. And we repositioned every single aspect of that business in 90 days.
Wow.
So I don't think it's a trade-off between, slow and consultative, and, and swift and responsive. I think you can do both. I think, you need to have real confidence in the system or the process, and you have to understand the process,
Sure.
but I don't think it's necessarily slower, at least in part, because you don't have to go through this huge corporate comms or, selling process, which
Right.
is usually where everything gets stuck.
Well, and I guess to the point that you mentioned earlier, which is we hire this consultant firm, they come in, they give all of these ideas, some of which can be great ideas, but the cynicism that's born from the start of this process slows the capacity or the ability of the organization to actually adopt them versus having that buy-in from the beginning with the process.
Yeah.
I want to shift gears, and you wrote and had a book published this February in the most kind of timely standpoint called Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. And there's a lot of discussion in there about past as well as potential future pandemics. And so
Mhm. Yes.
obviously the timing of this is quite incredible. And you talked about, or you have talked about, the scientist and the medical community that is on the cutting edge of looking forward thinking, how there's so much intelligence and expertise and insights to be gained. So I wanted to just kind of open the discussion there, and then we can just kind of riff.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it is eerie. I have to confess. It's eerie how much there is in the book about pandemics. And, obviously I was writing the book in 2019, so this was by no way a prediction. And when I was recording the audiobook, I just kept thinking, wow, I'd forgotten there's all this pandemics all over the darn thing. So that was kind of interesting. I think, one of the reasons that pandemics feature so strongly is not because I had this sixth sense at all.
Sure.
It's because pandemics are a fantastic illustration of what uncertainty really is.
Yeah.
So pandemics always happen. There's been no time in history where pandemics miraculously disappear, right?
Right.
They are a feature of life on Earth. They are all different, which is to say there is no profile of a pandemic. And as a consequence, it's impossible to predict them.
Sure.
So on the one hand, we are certain that they're going to happen. On the other hand, we don't know where they'll start, or when they will start, or where the pathogen will be. Right. So this is like the worst of all possible worlds, right? You know bad, evil stuff's going to happen, and you have no information on which to act.
Right.
And so this is really absolutely the definition of uncertainty.
Right. So
also high likelihood and a high impact, which makes it worse, right?
Sure.
And so traditionally, and especially in companies, the response has been, well, there's nothing we can do. Cross our fingers, rub rabbit's feet, whatever your method of determining the future might be, but let's just hope it doesn't happen. And at the end of the book, I wrote about this organization called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. And they said, no, hang on a second. We're not helpless just because we don't have, the date and the pathogen.
Right.
We know roughly how pandemics play out. We know they start small. We know they take off fast. We know that in any pandemic or epidemic, what you want, the holy grail, is a vaccine.
Sure.
And we also know that a whole bunch of very specific diseases have pandemic potential, whereas others do not. So let us look at those diseases, and let's start developing vaccines now, ahead of time, because we know that the average time that it takes to develop a vaccine is roughly about 4 years. Right. And well, that's the fastest we've done it until now. And the average is 10 years. So let's start now, before we need to, with the diseases that are most likely to have the worst impact. Now, I think that's a kind of obviously smart thing to do. And obviously, in present circumstances, absolutely brilliant, right? Because one of the first vaccines, so they chose 6 diseases. One of them was beta coronaviruses. And one of the first organizations they backed to get to work on those was Moderna, right? So this was an excellent plan, right? But the point is, they started Moderna working on beta coronaviruses in 2017.
Okay.
Right. Now you could say, with the benefit of hindsight, brilliant, well done. But the point that is more subtle than that, they invested in other vaccines which may never be used.
Sure.
Right? Or on vaccines for diseases which in our lifetime do not provoke pandemics. And business logic would say that's inefficient. And it's true. It is inefficient. There's lots and lots and lots of waste, billions of dollars of waste.
Yeah.
In the same way that we have approximately 200 vaccine candidates for COVID-19. That is, by anybody's measure, an extraordinary oversupply. But the point is, if you're efficient, you're too late.
Yeah.
If the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness hadn't started early, we wouldn't be where we are. If they hadn't started working early with lots of national healthcare systems and networks, we wouldn't be where we are now. And the coalition was set up primarily because of a kind of dawning horror at the fact that most governments had given up pandemic planning.
Right.
Both in the US and the UK, both governments had actually done quite a lot of work to be prepared for a pandemic, which as time wore on and the pandemic didn't turn up. They thought,
wasted it. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So the deeper point is that where you have things that are both uncertain and likely to have a big impact, instead of thinking about planning, which you can't do because you don't have the data that you need, you have to think about preparedness. And when you think about preparedness, you have to leave your efficiency demon out of the discussion.
Right.
Because if you are efficient in a context of uncertainty, you will cut out all your margins for error and surprise. And when the surprise occurs, you're in deep trouble. And a classic example of that can be seen here in the UK, where after the banking crisis, huge amounts of money was taken out of our National Health Service. And the consequence of that was that when the pandemic hit, we had about 9 beds per 100,000 people in the UK. The German government had 34 beds per 100,000 people, which meant the German government could bring people into hospital before they were desperately ill, which meant they were more likely to recover.
Yeah, dramatically different survivability rates between those two.
Exactly. Yeah. So the issue isn't throw efficiency out the window. It has its place, but its place is safest and most productive in environments which are predictable and where there's a high degree of unpredictability. Efficiency can kill you.
Right.
And it killed people here. There is no doubt about that. People have died because of efficiency in healthcare systems that are run for efficiency.
So you've talked about the benefit of utilizing scenario planning and experimentation, which I think is it's beautiful, right? And it's something that I honestly haven't heard much of since I was in school, and yet it's very purposeful in day-to-day business, certainly as we look at these catastrophic things that could happen, or I don't even want to call them catastrophic, they could just be major market changes, for an organization. Talk about the importance of those two, and how that can keep you, almost think of it as, we'll take it back to the pandemic, which we know if you are healthier, if you have less underlying conditions, you are going to be able to rebound much quicker. And so mentally, if we exercise our brain and if we nourish it through these things, we're going to be better suited to respond to these changes. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure. And your analogy is a really well taken one. I think that, scenario planning derived from the military.
Okay.
And it was developed in more detail for commercial purposes by Shell. And there was this very interesting Frenchman named Pierre Wack who said, almost all planning starts in finance. That was true then, it's true now, right?
Yep.
And generally what we do, I mean, we like to put a lot of mystique around it. Mostly what we do is we start from where we are and we extrapolate forward,
Right.
right? And we may, think, well, maybe there's going to be a bit of a slowdown because of this or that. But mostly we sort of think, what's the rate of growth? How do we chivvy the workers to work a bit harder? We set some higher goals. And that's kind of what planning mostly is in many,
Right.
many companies. And Wax said, we're starting in the wrong place because we're acting as if our company is in a sort of hermetically sealed bubble all by itself and not subject to the shocks of the environment. And especially when you're dealing with a natural resource, obviously as shell oil was,
Right.
that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
You're subject to environmental changes, you're subject to social and political changes in consumption, political changes in terms of where your supply is coming from.
Sure.
And to deny those is really to be blind. So we need a much richer process to think about what the future could hold, bearing in mind that we don't know what it will hold.
Right.
And so what he devised and recommended and carried out at Shell for many years was a process by which you collected a lot of data around the political environment, the social environment, consumption habits, all sorts of soft data as well as hard data, in order to draw 3 or 4 possible, plausible scenarios of what the future might look like. And the point was absolutely not to pick one, because that does not fall to us, right? What happens in the future isn't something I get to choose from a
Right.
menu. Otherwise, I would not have chosen 2020, right? The point is with each one to say, okay, if this one seemed to be what the future became, what would we wish we'd been doing now?
Right.
How would we prepare for it? And in response to it, what might we do?
Sure.
And do we have that responsive capacity?
Right.
And one of his scenarios, very famously, was that the oil price would fall, and everybody thought he was completely crazy because it's a natural resource, a limited supply. Of course, the price is going to go up forever.
Yeah.
But then, various governments in the Middle East changed their strategy, and woof, the oil price did fall. And this is the moment at which Shell just comes roaring out, becomes a super major, while all of its competitors are absolutely floundering. Because having worked through that scenario, they had seen lots of things that they could do if this happened. And half of them were just really smart things to do no matter what.
Right.
So they said, well, if they're smart things to do no matter what, let's just do them.
Sure.
And so that's sort of the origins of scenario planning. I talked to some people at the agrochemicals business in Genta, and they use scenario planning. And I talked to one of the executives who runs that there, and he was, they were looking at scenarios where there's a scenario of plenty, where energy is very cheap because it's naturally generated. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of everything. What happens when there is no scarcity?
Right.
How do you create value? It's an incredibly interesting question.
Sure.
But when I got him to introduce this scenario to a bunch of business leaders, a number of them really liked it and really got to town and thought of all sorts of fascinating ways of thinking about scarcity and value. But one entire team couldn't get their heads around it at all. It's so blue in the face of everything they've been brought up to believe. And I asked him afterwards, I said, does that happen often, that people are just paralyzed?
Right.
He said, oh, yeah. He said, because especially the more senior people are, they just can't get their heads around a different kind of world.
Right.
And he said, in fact, what he had found was that the people who are best at this are more junior in the organization, and they typically have played quite a lot of computer games.
Sure.
Because that's really what all these games are, right? If I go left, this happens. If I go right, that happens. If I back up, maybe I could do something else. And he said they have this flexibility of thinking in the way that the more senior people didn't. And they understand that thinking through these puzzles is fun, right?
Yeah, right.
It's
The
fun,
exercise of it.
interesting. It's
Yeah.
a creative, imaginative thing to do. And so I think it's, it's quite an interesting challenge, I think, for businesses on two fronts. One, can they do this?
Hmm.
And two, can they do it as a way of keeping their thinking highly adaptive and responsive? And you're much more likely to see them early or even to monitor for them so that you have some early warning sign that, oops, that scenario we talked about, actually we ought perhaps go back at it and look at it and see what our brilliant ideas were, because some of that seems to be coming true now.
Sure. We had a guest on earlier this year, Christo Popov, and he talked about kind of in the face of challenging times, splitting his organization into different departments, really, almost as their own unique entity. One was firefighting, let's focus on cash and make sure
Yeah.
our lifeblood stays true. But one that struck me, and it was the word he used, he had a kamikaze team, and that team was specifically designed to rip apart the current business model and look in the marketplace. And it struck me as that's just a good exercise to be doing constantly, because that exercise, to your point, I love hearing the psychology behind it, being primed puts you in a better position, and you might actually have a plan that
Yeah.
lines up to what's being presented.
Right. Well, it's interesting because you put me in mind of a business leadership team that I worked with some years ago. And this was a very, very contentious, very kind of scrappy, rancorous team. And I challenged them about a lot of the way that, they worked together, and said, the problem is, as you're all fighting each other, you may miss what's happening in the great outside world.
Sure.
To which, and I'm simplifying this quite a lot, but to which their response was, look, we're the market leader. The outside world is not our problem. The inside world right now is our problem, that we can't quite find the right way to work together. And I said, you don't think the outside world is your problem? No, we're the market leader. I said, okay. So let me ask you a question. If you were living in an age of disruption, if
Right.
you were going to disrupt this company, how would you do it? What do you mean? What do you mean? I said, I guarantee you there are some kids out there looking at you and
Right.
thinking, that's a stupid way to do it. Why don't they do it this other way? Tell me what the other way is.
Right.
Anyway, they thought that was just a fatuous intellectual exercise. And I had the dubious pleasure several years later of working for those disruptors.
Ah.
And, they had been on the case
Right.
for years.
Right.
They saw exactly where the company weaknesses were. And they, and they won.
Well, so I want to take this further, because this really lends itself to me to the experimentation side of it, which is scenario planning is a good exercise. And I do think it fundamentally fits the verb exercise. But I want to talk about experimentation, because now we're taking action, and now we're applying things. And you have a eloquent story about a hospital system in the Netherlands. And I'd love for you to just share that, and then just talk about how organizationally, and Amazon was one that comes to mind for me. They're constantly, I've heard they've spent billions of dollars on failed experiments. So when you hear that, it's no surprise to think of them being the powerhouse that they are today, because they are willing to financially and from a time standpoint put equity behind failing, because they know they will find something positive.
That's right. So I think there are just lots and lots and lots of business issues that you cannot solve by thinking about them. Right. And that's
Right.
when you have to do an experiment. You have to just try it. And I have sat in too many boardrooms where people thought they could just think their way to the solution. And you can't. If you do, you just let all your biases kind of run away with you.
Sure.
And you can't do a spreadsheet model, and you just have to try stuff. And this is a really beautiful example. So in the Netherlands, a great deal of nursing, or a great deal of healthcare, depends on community nursing. There's a huge push to get people out of hospitals as soon as possible because we know that they recover faster that
Right.
way.
Right.
And home tends to be, for most people, a healthier, happier environment
Yep.
than a hospital.
Very much
Um,
so.
and so they had, they had a very large network of nurses providing this service. And it was run as much healthcare is on a kind of industrialized model. So, there's a standard contract, and then you get allocated a level of service, which is its own SKU. And then that means you get, allocated a certain nurse, and the nurse gets allocated a certain schedule. And then the nurse turns up, Monday for 10 minutes and Wednesday for 7 minutes and Fridays for 8 minutes. And then the invoices are generated and so on and so on. It's exactly like an assembly line. And it kind of works in its fashion, but it's quite a big, heavy, expensive bureaucracy, and everybody hated it. The nurses hated it, the patients hated it, because they didn't really, they didn't have a relationship with these
Right.
people coming. Say, I'm sorry, I've only got 7 minutes on my schedule today. And one of the nurses said, it just felt like patients were like apples just being picked and packed off. And fortunately, the nurse who thought that had trained as an economist, which is a pretty unusual combination. And he thought about it, and he had a very, very brilliant insight. He said, this looks like one business, one continuous operation, but actually it's two. There is the whole administrative bureaucratic side, which is the contract and the invoicing and all that jazz. And there's another piece of it, which is looking after the patient.
Yeah.
The first piece is what we think of as complicated, which is to say it's linear, you can control all of it, and it repeats itself. But the second piece is complex because it isn't linear. Yeah. Every patient is different. Two patients coming out of the hospital with the same procedure will recover at a different rate and need different things.
Sure.
And it's it's inherently, therefore, unpredictable. So he said, so you have these two systems sitting uncomfortably lashed together, the complicated and the complex. So he said, the complicated, we can automate all that stuff. It's not that hard. Computers, brilliant at anything that's repetitive, drudgery. But the human piece, which is unpredictable, let's give 40 patients to a team of 10 nurses, and their only job description is do what you think is right. And let's see if that's better. That was the experiment.
Okay.
10 nurses, 40 patients, let's see what happens. And what happened was the patients got better in half the time, and the cost of providing the service fell by 30%. And when I said to him, so what about this experiment surprised you? He just burst out laughing. And he said, I just had no idea you could make such a huge improvement so simply.
Right.
Now, you could never, if you were told, cut 30% out of the nursing.
No.
And here's the spreadsheet. You'd never get there that way.
Right.
And that's the value of the experiment, which is he didn't know what the outcome would be. It's not like a scientific experiment if there's a hypothesis. Right? He just thought, let's see. And, there are two things I think about this in the context of businesses. The first is how many opportunities there are for this. And the second is how few companies do it.
Right.
I've been mesmerized, as I think many commentators have, by the bloodbath that is retail. And mesmerized watching retailers do all the same old stuff they did, cut prices, cut staffing, have endless sales and compete with all the stores around you, right?
Yeah.
It's slashing everything that moves. Not a single experiment, nothing about make this a destination that is so fabulous people want to come, nothing about great service, nothing about, anything. Just let's do the same old stuff that's killing us and see if somehow miraculously, like some kind of chemotherapy, we get we poison ourselves and live to be healthy. Let's try, who knows? And I'm really struck Amazon's very famous for its experiments. 3M is very famous for its experiments. And I think there's something important to be said about this. It isn't just doing the experiments and selecting the ones that win. One of the things, or that deliver a really positive outcome, one of the things that's so impressive about 3M is that when they do an experiment, if it doesn't lead to some new business or material or something, they have a postmortem. It's not about blame. It's just, why did it not work?
Sure.
And very often the reason the experiment won't work is to do with context, which is, the demand isn't there, or this material is in short supply, so it's just too expensive, too hard to get to scale, any number of things,
Sure.
which aren't necessarily to do with the product. And the reason they do that is because those things can change quite quickly, quite unexpectedly.
Right.
And so they're institutionalizing the understanding of this. And they're famous for bringing out just the right thing when you need it. It's not because they're fast.
Right.
It's because they're prepared. It's because they have this thing, a little bit like the vaccine, right?
Yeah.
That actually they worked on before.
Yes.
And now the market has shifted, and now it's exactly what people want. So they're very, very smart about what can we do and what do we need the world to do to make these two things fit together.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I do think as we talk about vaccines and your traditional timeline and the fastest 4 years, and now we're sitting here and it's getting faster and faster as far as being able to have concept to market, and it felt revolutionary as far as being able to have something that hits March, right, at least stateside here, to where we're talking about potentially administering vaccines to the public in January. Like, that timeline is just so compressed. But as you alliterated, it's actually been being worked on for years before, 2017, which actually now suddenly fits kind of a traditional 4-year fast timeline that you talked about.
In addition, there's been a huge amount of fundamental science being done on beta coronaviruses, on immunological systems, and all of this played into it. And it's quite interesting, because you very often have these situations where, why are we doing this abstract science? No good will come of it. The thing about science, and this is so important, you don't know what you need to know.
Yeah.
So you do fundamental science because you don't know what you're going to find, right? That's why it is the territory of experiments.
Sure.
And, one of the new vaccines that whose data was released this week from AstraZeneca, they had a program going, which is really fascinating, because it's a completely different mental model, which is, could we essentially start thinking of a kind of Lego style vaccine, where the transporter of the vaccine is one thing, and it could carry anything.
Right.
And then we bolt on the specific antigen that we want. And having been, and so they thought of this as disease X, that it's just a kind of taxi to get right what's going to provoke the immune response.
Sure.
But they've been thinking that through conceptually and practically for much more time than since the pandemic.
Right.
So, and it was a kind of pie in the sky concept, which, it might have gone somewhere, it might not. But it's one of the reasons why it's so vital in academic science that this work is done, even when it looks, as I said before, even when it looks inefficient and often kind of pointless.
Okay, well, let's shift gears. I want to do a quick fire round. So is there a favorite podcast that you're listening to right now that you'd like to share with people?
Oh, gosh. I listen to so many podcasts. I'm trying to think of the name of it. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
It's a podcast series. It's about the failure of WeWork. Oh. And it's fascinating. And I'm also at the same time reading a brand new piece by Charles Duhigg in the New Yorker about the failure of WeWork, and by implication, the failure of venture capital. And
Okay.
listening to the two together is just tremendous.
Well, we'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. I am
Yeah.
kind of fascinated as a byproduct of
It's a podcast
remote.
about business failures. And it's my sort of love of what I think of as business car crash stories.
Sure.
You
Yes.
know,
Yes.
everything. So it's called Business Wars.
Okay. Perfect. Who to you is your professional inspiration, whether living or posthumous?
Mm. I get my real professional inspiration from artists of all kinds. I write about them a lot in my book, and the reason is they live in uncertainty. They live with uncertainty. They don't aim at targets. They know that what they're doing may fail, and often when it's finished, they can't tell if it's successful.
Right.
And yet they persevere. And I mean, I worked with a lot of fantastic writers, actors, directors, musicians, painters. Um, and they inspire the world, right?
Yeah.
And they have this incredible capacity to pick up the zeitgeist in a way that no other group of people I have ever worked with can do. And they do that because they're fantastic noticers.
Yeah.
Most of them walk aimlessly as a habit. They take long walks all the time. And they're connecting kind of who they are with what's happening in the world in a very subtle way. But I think the thing that most inspires me is they don't wait for the data before they start. They start without being asked. They change before they need to. And in this respect, they're quite similar to entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
But what's so incredible about this is they often make things that are relevant and meaningful for centuries.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to dig into that more as part of my prep. I came across this and it's something I instantly resonated with. Next question, early riser or midnight oil?
Early riser for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. And then is there, you mentioned, so were those both podcasts or was one of them a book that you're reading? Because always curious what's on the shelf, and obviously you have a lot on your shelf right now. So
I have a lot on my shelf. I always have I have stacks of books that I want to read. Yeah, the article I'm reading is in the New Yorker by Charles Duhigg, and it's about venture capitalists. Venture capital, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Right.
And I think the book I'm reading at the moment is by an American kind of historian and philosopher named Susan Neiman, and it's a book called Learning from the Germans, and it's about what do we do with our bad history, and how can we use it to learn instead of burying it. And given that every country has quite a lot of bad history, how do we stop this undermining the best of us?
Right. Okay.
Brilliant book.
Well, thank you. Always looking for a good read. Speaking of books, you've written another book, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril, centers around willfulness, ignorance.
Willful blindness.
Thank you. So let's talk about that because I do think that this is a very interesting concept that we as individuals and we as organizations very, very easily fall into. So I'll open it up to you there.
Yeah, so willful blindness is a legal term, in fact, and I came across it in the transcript of the trial of Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling, the chairman and chief exec of Enron. And the legal concept says if there are things that you could know and should know and manage not to know, the law deems that you've been willfully blind.
Okay.
You had an opportunity for knowledge and you shirked it. And it was in that context that they were both found guilty when the Department of Justice, brought them to court. And I remember reading that and a sort of chill going down my spine because I thought, I'm pretty sure in my companies at some point there were things I could have known and should have known and didn't know. So it's a very high standard.
Yeah.
But then, all sorts of things sprang to mind, the degree to which we could have known and should have known how inflated and dangerous the subprime mortgage market was.
Yeah.
The people in Volkswagen could have known and should have known how they were achieving their remarkable emissions
Mission
numbers.
standards.
Wells Fargo, people should, the leadership should have known and could have known about gross mis-selling. And I could go on and on and on. I talked about the scandal of the Catholic Church and pedophilia. So what I realized as I started researching this phenomenon is it's just everywhere.
Right.
It's in companies, it's in countries, it's in families, it's in ourselves. And so I was extremely driven to figure out how does this work and why does this work and what can we do, if not to eradicate it, at least mitigate it.
Sure.
And it's sadly, it's an idea with immense traction. In fact, in the New Yorker piece about WeWork that I was just citing, somebody says about the board of WeWork, we were willfully ignorant. That they let this very charismatic founder just get away with nonsense, unbelievable nonsense, because they didn't want the conflict, they didn't want to risk losing, this maestro. Theranos is another great example of willful blindness, right? This, not terribly scientific young woman attracting a lot of old white men to invest huge amounts of money in her business. They were clearly dazzled. She was clearly very charismatic. The most obvious of questions were never asked, and neither was there any real scientific strength on the board itself. So this is ubiquitous. And it's not about bad people. It is about bad people, but more profoundly, it's about bad systems. And so my book really looked at, what are the conditions in which willful blindness flourishes? And how can you organize your life and your organization in ways that make it less susceptible? And I think, one of the many astounding things I discovered in the course of this was a phenomenon known in academic circles as organizational silence, which is if you ask a cross-section of executives, do you have issues or concerns that you don't voice? In the academic research, 85% of people say yes.
Right.
And this really speaks to the narrative of willful blindness, which is whenever a scandal breaks, the first thing is, well, nobody had any idea. Then it turns out one or two people did have an idea and may even have tried to sound the alarm. And then it turns out, well, you know what, pretty much everybody. Right. And so, so there's a real leadership question here, which is, as a leader in an organization, how do you create a culture and an environment and processes which ensure that when I'm a bit worried about something, instead of shutting up, I can raise it, I can explore it, we can fix it. And it's interesting because, I've gone around the world talking about this book to all kinds of audiences. And I quite often will poll the audience, especially if it's, with business leaders, and ask them, how comfortable do you feel thinking that you know everything you need to know about what's going on in your business? And I have never done an event where the numbers were below 50%.
Right.
In other words, at least half of every audience of business leaders knows they don't know what's going on. I think that's pretty chilling.
Oh, without question. And I guess I'd like to just dig in a little bit in what are these underlying attributes. I do feel like this has been an awakening year for everybody, and to the degree and to what you're awakening to, I think is different across the board. But there's a word that I feel is applicable here, which is diversity. And I've talked with a couple of guests about the importance of diversity within an organization to get out of this kind of groupthink environment where we just suddenly champion the same idea over and over without really challenging it. And that's could be benign, could be malignant. It depends organizationally, but I do feel like diversity is a great way to mitigate this, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, there's no question. And, I wrote in my book quite a lot about BP, the Texas City disaster, and the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And, one of the things that's very striking when you look at the BP management team in both of those cases is they're pretty much all the same kind of people.
Right.
Same background, same educational background, same everything. And very, very, very little dissent.
Yeah.
And, the truth is that the reason you want diversity, apart from issues of social justice, which I'm not trivializing, you want diversity in order that people can see things from different perspectives and therefore see different things. And many people say, yeah, but then everybody's going to argue. That's the whole point, right?
Yes.
Because conflict is how organizations think. And, and Alfred Sloan, years ago running GM said, if the decision's unanimous, why is everybody here?
Right.
Right? Somebody's not doing their job.
Right.
The whole point is to have, what I think of as cordial conflict.
Sure.
In order that we can see what the risks are, we can see what the opportunities are. And I think that, that when you think about willful blindness, it's partly that people are not stepping up to say there's a problem here, or that this decision could be risky because. It's also they're not stepping up to say, hey, there's a big opportunity here. Why are we not paying attention?
Right.
Everyone keeps telling us how Google is the smartest, most brilliant company the universe has ever seen. So explain to me how they missed social networking. Right. Yeah. So this is not about, do we have enough clever people? Do we have enough diversity? Is there a safe enough environment where people will speak up? Do we know how to have cordial conflict in a way that's really constructive?
Sure.
And doing that, can we see more and make better decisions? Because don't forget, the basis of Irving Janis's groupthink theory is not just everybody thinks the same. It's worse than that. It's that when everybody thinks the same, they're prone to taking bigger risks. So you both have a lack of diversity, but it's more gung-ho. Right?
Yeah, right.
So this is exactly what you don't want. And what's really fascinating, if you go back to the original book, which is a beautiful piece of writing, he put side by side, President Kennedy's fiasco in the Bay of Pigs next to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And says, I think quite rightly, this is probably one of the greatest examples of executive learning the world has ever seen. Because he does all the willful blindness stuff with the Bay of Pigs. And when it comes to the Cuban Missile Crisis, with that disaster very clearly fresh in his memory, he does everything different. And, and he has really diverse views, and he has multiple teams working the same problem. And they're not all top people. They're also junior people, but the junior people are working together so they're not intimidated by the top people. He has mind guards. He has devil's advocates. He has everything.
Right.
And, and it's a model of really thoughtful decision-making.
Again, I'm tempted to open the political door, but I'm gonna show restraint because what I want to get back to is the artistry that you talked about, and just thinking about this. And it's when I heard you mention it, it's something that instantly resonated because specifically when you talked about taking these long walks, there is an element to artistry which is not putting out into the world. It's simply soaking up the world. And that to me is a very profound thing, especially, as we think about the context of business, I've often said to my teams, hey, we're not providing a service for us, we're providing a service for our customers. So we really need to be listening to our customers to hear what's happening. How is it changing? And that's just a very eloquent example of that in referencing the artist.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, that in a way, the artist regards him or herself as a processor, right?
Right.
Sucking in all of this stuff and I'm processing it and producing something completely different from that. And it's a very, in most cases, very unconscious
Sure.
experience, which requires quite a lot of attention and freedom. And I think what's interesting, if you apply that to a business context, then the one thing you absolutely don't want if you value this process is the gig economy.
Mm.
Right? Because gig workers don't give two hoots about your customers. Why
Yeah.
should they?
Right.
Their employers don't care about them. They don't care about the business, and they don't care about customers. And if a customer says something like, oh, it's always so annoying that, the pizza's too salty or it's too hot or it's not hot enough or whatever, what are they going to do with that? Nothing.
Right.
Why bother? They're on a tight schedule. They're just going to deliver the next pizza, and it's going to carry on being too salty, too salty, too salty. The customer's going to vanish. You won't know why. Nobody's going to tell you because it's not in anybody's interest if all they have to do is crank through the schedule and try desperately not to get fired.
Right.
And, I'm always astounded. I have to explain to people why actually having employees who care about the business really matters. But every time you meet a customer, there's something to learn.
Yeah.
Is anybody curious enough, motivated enough? Do they have enough time? Do they have enough freedom to use that opportunity? Or are they simply thinking, look, nobody asked me to do this. It's not in my job description. I have 57 targets, goals, and KPIs, and I'm going to hit those, and that's what I'm going to do. And if the customer says something genius to me, like, wow, it'd be really great if you could X, brilliant business idea, it doesn't matter. It's just going to be missed.
Yes. Well, I hope someday to be able to take a walk with you and continue this conversation. I'd like to leave with one final question, which is you've had a very diverse career. So you obviously have a lot of insights that you've gained along that career. If you were to go back and impart one piece of wisdom, what do you think you might tell younger you that's kind of just starting out your career?
Wow, that's a really fantastic question. I think I would simply say, be bolder.
Mm.
I think I've been pretty bold. I think my whole career has been an experiment. But I think, and I don't, I'm very grateful for for the opportunities I've had. But I think, like many people, and definitely like many women, I think, and this is going to sound very boastful, but I think, especially at the beginning, I didn't know how good I was.
Mm.
And I think, like many people at the beginning of their careers, I thought I had to be like everyone else.
Right.
And I spent a lot of energy trying to be like everybody else until finally I just gave up because I couldn't.
Right.
And it never occurred to me that that was an advantage. So I wish I'd known that.
Sure.
That instead of trying so hard to fit in, I wish I could have been more comfortable standing out.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I think, so I'm in Portland, Oregon. We have a city motto, which is keep Portland weird. I've always embraced that. I've embraced the differentness of that. And it's not something that is easy to embrace because I think conformity is so much more natural within society. And so having the internal recognition to say, hey, it's all right. I've got something that's different that is valuable. I'm not going to be afraid. I think that's a wonderful lesson to share with the viewers.
Yeah, and I still say that to myself sometimes. Like, oh, come on, Margaret, stop being so namby-pamby and just cut to the chase.
I love it.
So we go on learning forever.
Correct. Well, Margaret, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would very much look forward to having you back in the future.
Well, I loved our conversation, Josh. So thanks for asking such thoughtful questions.
Okay. Have a lovely holiday.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.
Before you go, if you liked today's Ask an Expert with Margaret as much as I did, make sure you hit the like button and add a comment down below. Also, make sure to subscribe. We have a number of great guests coming up in the future, and by subscribing, you'll instantly be notified as we drop each new episode. Until then, stay safe and have a great day.